3 hours from now in Rome, under the red clay of Foro Italico, something is about to happen that most people are still underestimating. On paper, it looks simple. Elena Rybakina, the reigning Australian Open champion and one of the most powerful ball strikers in women's tennis, steps onto court as the overwhelming favourite. Across from her stands Alex Eala, a 20-year-old Filipina ranked outside the top 40, still labelled by many as emerging talent. But if that is still the way you are reading this matchup, you are already behind the story. Because what is building here is not a routine third-round match. It is a collision between a finished product and a player still evolving in real time, except that evolution is happening faster than anyone expected. And here is the first thing you need to understand. Eala is no longer just competing. She is problem-solving against top 10 players and solving those problems more often than not. 4 wins against elite opposition this season. Multiple surfaces, different conditions, different styles. And each time, instead of collapsing under pressure, she has adapted mid-match like a player far older, far more experienced, and far more dangerous than her ranking suggests. So when people say Rybakina should win comfortably, they are not wrong based on reputation, but they might be wrong based on current reality. Let's break this down properly. Rybakina is built for destruction. Her game is not complicated, it is efficient. First serve, immediate control. Flat forehand, immediate damage. Short points, maximum pressure. When she is in rhythm, opponents don't get chances to breathe, let alone build momentum. That is why she has already beaten the best in the world and lifted Grand Slam titles. But clay changes the equation, not completely, not dramatically, but enough. Clay slows the ball just slightly. It increases rally length. It reduces the free power from first strike tennis. And most importantly, it exposes players who rely on finishing points early instead of constructing them patiently. That is where this match becomes interesting. Because Alex Eala does not need quick points to feel comfortable. In fact, she thrives when rallies stretch longer, when patterns develop, when opponents start missing patience before she does. And that is exactly the trap clay sets for power players like Rybakina. But before we even get to tactics, you have to understand what Eala has already survived in this tournament. She didn't arrive in Rome and stumble into form. She built it point by point. First round, she absorbs pressure against Magdalena Frech, a veteran clay competitor who knows how to extend matches and force mistakes. Early momentum swings, long rallies, tight games, but Eala stays composed, resets mentally, and finishes strong. Second match, she faces Wang Xinyu, and this is where the warning signs become loud. 7 breaks of serve, 0 double faults, complete control in the decisive moments. Not just winning, but dictating the rhythm of the match like she owns it. That is not luck, that is pattern recognition under pressure. And now she walks into the biggest test of her clay court life. Rybakina, a player who has already proven she can crush top 10 opponents without mercy. A player who recently dismantled Maria Sakkari with cold efficiency. A player who on hard courts and grass looks almost untouchable when her serve is firing. So the question is simple. What happens when that weapon is slightly reduced? Because on clay, Rybakina's serve does not disappear, but it loses some of its immediate destruction power. The bounce is higher, the return time is longer, and that tiny delay gives opponents something priceless, reaction time. And reaction time is exactly what Eala needs to turn this match into something unpredictable. Now here comes the first major strategic battle. If Eala can consistently return deep on second serve, she forces Rybakina into longer baseline exchanges. And that is where the underdog starts to gain ground, because Eala's forehand is not just about power. It is about spin, heavy left-handed rotation that climbs off the clay, pushing opponents into uncomfortable contact zones. Against most players, that is annoying. Against Rybakina, it is dangerous. Why? Because Rybakina prefers waist-height contact where she can flatten the ball and strike clean winners. But if the ball keeps rising above her strike zone, she loses that comfort. And when comfort disappears, timing starts to break down. And once timing breaks down, even the best players start missing patterns they usually never miss. But here is where we insert the reality check. Rybakina does not need many chances. One clean service game can reset momentum instantly. One aggressive return game can break belief. One 15-minute stretch of dominance can erase everything built before it. That is why Eala cannot afford emotional dips. And this is where her biggest growth becomes important. Earlier in her career, she would rush under pressure, try to end points too quickly, chase highlight winners instead of building structure. But in recent months, especially during her top 10 wins, something has changed. She is slowing the game down mentally, not physically, mentally. She is constructing points, reading opponents, waiting for the right moment instead of forcing it. That shift is the difference between a promising player and a dangerous one. And if there is one thing Rybakina does not like, it is extended pressure exchanges where she is forced to hit 5, 6, 7 extra balls per point. Because even elite power players start to feel discomfort when rallies extend beyond their preferred structure. So now we arrive at the first big turning point of this match. If Eala survives the opening service games without panic, if she forces even one early break opportunity, suddenly the pressure flips. Not fully, not permanently, but enough to change decision-making. And that is where underdog matches start to become unpredictable, but there is still one massive question left unanswered. Can Eala actually handle the moment when Rybakina raises her level? Because champions do not stay passive forever. At some point, the favorite will strike back with full intensity. First serves will land, forehands will flatten, tempo will increase dramatically, and that is where most young challengers disappear. But Eala has shown something different this season. She does not disappear, she adjusts, and if she adjusts fast enough tonight, this match stops being a prediction and becomes a problem the entire tennis world was not ready for. Now everything shifts from theory to execution, because this is where matches like this are actually decided. If Alexandra Eala wants to turn this into more than just a competitive showing, she cannot afford to wait for mistakes from Elena Rybakina. That is the most important truth in this entire matchup. Waiting is exactly what power players want. Waiting means reacting, waiting means defending, and against someone who can end points in 2 or 3 shots when in rhythm, defending is a slow form of surrender. So Eala's real mission is not to survive, it is to disrupt. And disruption on clay does not always look dramatic. Sometimes it is subtle, a deeper return, a heavier cross-court forehand, a slightly higher margin over the net, a longer rally that forces one extra swing. That is how you break a player like Rybakina, not by overpowering her, but by making her uncomfortable long enough for rhythm to dissolve. The first weapon in this disruption plan is return position. If Eala stands too far back, she gives Rybakina too much control on first serve. If she stands too close, she risks being overpowered. The balance is critical, but the key idea is simple. She must take time away from the second serve. Because Rybakina's second serve, while solid, is not untouchable. On clay especially, it sits up slightly more. And if Eala steps in aggressively and commits early to the return, she can immediately turn defense into offense. That single pattern change is where pressure begins, and pressure, once introduced, spreads quickly. Now let's talk about baseline exchanges, because this is where the real tactical war happens. Rybakina wants clean strikes. She wants predictable bounce. She wants short rhythm patterns where she can dictate with minimal movement. Eala must destroy that comfort. How? By constantly changing height, heavy topspin cross-court, deep looping balls to the backhand, sudden acceleration down the line, not random aggression but structured unpredictability. Because the moment Rybakina is forced to adjust her swing path repeatedly, she loses that smooth hitting rhythm that makes her so dangerous. And there is another layer here that often gets overlooked. Footwork pressure. On clay, even the best movers have to work harder to reset between shots. If Eala extends rallies beyond 8 or 9 shots consistently, she is not just testing shot quality, she is testing physical patience. And that is where fatigue starts to creep in, even for elite athletes. But here is the danger for Eala. Rybakina does not need long rallies to hurt you. One short burst is enough. One return winner, one forehand down the line. One aggressive serve plus forehand combination. And suddenly all that tactical work gets erased. That is why this match is a constant balance between building pressure and avoiding collapse. Now let's shift to the emotional battlefield, because this is where most analysts underestimate Eala. She does not play like a player intimidated by the moment anymore. Earlier in her career, big names created hesitation. You could see it in shot selection. Slightly safer angles, slightly more passive returns. But against top 10 players this season, that hesitation has been replaced by intent. She is not guessing anymore. She is committing, and commitment in tennis is everything, because half swings lose matches. Full commitment creates outcomes. Now imagine what happens if she breaks Rybakina's serve even once early in the match. The entire stadium changes, not because the score suddenly flips, but because belief enters the equation, and belief is contagious. The crowd starts reacting earlier. Rybakina starts feeling time pressure on service games. Eala starts swinging freer, and suddenly what looked like a controlled favorites match becomes something chaotic. That is where underdogs live, but there is another psychological layer nobody talks about enough. Expectation pressure. Rybakina is expected to dominate here, not just win but dominate. That expectation creates invisible weight. Every missed first serve becomes slightly heavier. Every unforced error becomes slightly louder in her mind, and if Eala forces her into extended service games, that pressure multiplies. Because champions are not just playing opponents, they are also playing expectations. Eala, meanwhile, carries almost none of that burden. If she loses, the world calls it experience. If she wins, the world calls it a breakthrough. That freedom allows her to take risks at moments where Rybakina might hesitate. And in matches this tight, hesitation is costly. Now let's zoom into the most dangerous phase of this match, mid-set momentum swings. This is where Rybakina is historically at her most lethal. If she senses weakness, she accelerates instantly. No gradual build-up, just sudden domination. And if Eala loses concentration even for a few games, the scoreboard can move quickly out of reach. So the key question becomes simple. Can Eala absorb the storm without breaking? Because storms are coming. There will be phases where Rybakina looks untouchable, where serves land perfectly, where forehands explode off the court, where rallies feel impossible to win. That is the moment where young players usually disappear mentally. But Eala has shown something different this season. She does not fold immediately. She resets between points, between games, between momentum swings. That reset ability is what keeps her alive in matches that should already be over. And if she can maintain that mental reset under full pressure in Rome, then something very interesting happens. Rybakina is forced into longer matches, and longer matches on clay are where uncertainty begins to grow, because even the best power players cannot sustain peak aggression forever when points stretch, legs burn, and rhythm keeps getting interrupted. So now we arrive at the real turning point. If Eala can keep this match competitive past the first set, if she can force extended rallies consistently, if she can extract even small physical and mental strain from Rybakina, then the final set stops being predictable and starts becoming a test of endurance, nerve, and belief. And in those conditions, rankings stop mattering as much as mentality. Which brings us to the final phase of this battle, where one player tries to close it with power, and the other tries to survive long enough for opportunity